everyone. Welcome to Here We Are, Brattleboro's community talk show. I'm Wendy O'Connell. We are back in the studio. I think this is our fourth show back in the studio. And we are behind plexiglass, which you will see. You might see our reflections kind of scooting off each other during the show. But we welcome you. We're glad to have you with us. And today my guest is GennaRose Nethercott. Jenna is a poet, a writer, and a performer. She is the author of The Lumberjack Stuff, winner of the National Poetry Series Award, and most recently, the book Leanna Fled the Cranberry Bog, a study in cootie catchers, which we're going to hear about. And she was born and raised in Brattleboro, and she is a Massachusetts Cultural Council Artist Fellow. She's done lots more than that, and we're going to hear all about it. Hi, GennaRose.
Hi, Wendy.
Good to see you.
Good to see you, too.
Yes, it's nice to be wearing lipstick in public, isn't it?
I know, it's great.
Without a mask.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank God for plexiglass.
Indeed,
Yes.
An excuse to spruce up.
That's right. Thanks for coming on the show. It's great to have you on the show. We have a lot to talk about. You've done so many different things. But you were born and raised in Brattleboro, as I said, and you went to the public schools here?
I did, yeah. Well, I was in Brattleboro up until around 3rd grade, and then my family moved to Guilford, but I've been in the area here.
Way out in Guilford.
Way out in Guilford, the boonies. Yep. And yeah, I went through the public school system. I was in academy school and then Guilford Elementary, and then went through BUHS. So, yeah, I'm a big proponent of public school education.
And your family was a performing family.
Yes,
right?
Yeah. So, well, my mother, I think, was dragged in on the peripheries. She's not performatively inclined. She's a therapist, but my father is also a writer, and he also was a clown. And so growing up, me and my father and my brother had like a touring family clown act. Your standard American childhood. And yeah, we would travel primarily to Vermont libraries every summer performing the family act as professional child touring clowns. So yeah, for anyone who's met me, I feel like whenever I tell them that, it kind of explains a lot about my general exuding clown energy. So here we are today.
Did you have a name?
Yes. So my clown name, which I named myself at age 4, was Chicken Bump.
Chicken Bump.
Yes.
B-U-M-P.
Yes.
Yeah.
It sounds a little like a venereal disease, but here we are today again, and Chicken Bump in the flesh. So I thought it was very elegant as a 4-year-old.
Did you? That's so good. And you kept it?
Well, I haven't clowned in a while, but I think, yes, in my heart, I still have kept Chicken Bump as a moniker.
So you started around the age of 4?
Probably before that.
Really?
I mean, my dad would kind of take me along on various escapades.
Yes. And just so the folks know, GennaRose's father, which many people I'm sure know, is Michael Nethercott. And he's been around town. We've seen him in many different performance arenas. So that's the reference there. Can you talk about what it was like performing as a child?
Yeah, I mean, even now when I think back on it, sometimes I kind of forget that it was a strange or unique way to grow up. But I think it, in a lot of ways, enabled me to be comfortable speaking in front of people at a very young age. And the process we would go through was often a number of months first with just me and my father and my brother kind of devising skits and stories and experiences for an audience. So from a young age, I had this experience of practicing that kind of devising process as a group and arguing our way through and classic family bickering in the context of like clown imagining, which is a particularly heightened experience, I think. And then the second half of it would be, touring through the summers as sort of our summer job.
Yeah.
So we would fill the trunk of our car with props, and we'd drive around the state, and we'd do this show. And so I have these sort of strange flashes of memory of all these different venues and libraries throughout the state, and the three of us voyaging around and popping on stage. And I remember being a kid and like another child asked for my autograph, and I was like, this is it. I've made it.
Wow.
Finally, celebrity has found me. Like signing my name in a one-room library in rural Vermont.
The fact that you were devising at a very young age, and you were also collaborating, and you were also having stories told and telling stories, which is, of course, what kids thrive on. Yeah. Any more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would be remiss to ignore the fact that I think so much of my life as a storyteller now must have come from being raised and taught to tell stories from the time I could speak. I've talked about this before in interviews, but I have this folder, like a Lisa Frank folder with like sparkly snow leopards on the cover in true 90s fashion, that's full of poems which I wrote before I could physically write, that my father would write. He would transcribe as I spoke them to him.
That's so interesting.
So yeah, so I was like encouraged since I was very small in order to kind of develop my poetic voice and my voice as a writer. So yeah, it was always just sort of a part of the way I communicated since I was very young.
Yeah.
And I didn't actually actively want to be a writer until I was an adult. I kind of actively avoided it for a long time because I was trying to be more practical, I think. I was like, no, becoming a poet is a fool's errand. I'll be an English teacher, or, something that was equally relevant to my passions but felt like a more practical choice. And, but I always wrote. And then it was later that I decided to really buckle down and make it a career.
When you were writing, say between the ages of, elementary school up until college, were you composing stories? Were you writing in that way, or poems for yourself?
Yeah, well, and to share. I mean, I was still entering writing contests, and like I had something published when I was 11 in an anthology, and and for myself and for school, and anytime I had like a school assignment that I could twist into a creative writing project, I would do it. If there was a report on a certain historical time or character or document, I would ask my teacher if I could actually write it as a journal entry from the voice of this character. So I think from the time I was very, very young, I was finding every outlet that I could in order to compose stories or poetry or lyrics or what have you.
So during the process of public school here in Brattleboro, did you get support for that? When you said, can I do this, were the teachers supportive?
Yeah, for the most part, absolutely. I think there was, at least when I was at BUHS, there was an incredibly strong group of educators who really were passionate about developing the creative and intellectual sides of the students, especially when they saw students who were hungry for that or wanted to reach for it.
Right.
Yeah, so I feel like I did have that flexibility.
You went on to Hampshire College.
I did.
And you majored in poetry and folklore?
Yeah, so Hampshire doesn't really have majors. You kind of make it up.
That's right.
So I studied a combination of poetry and theater and supernatural folklore ethnology, which is sort of the social and psychological functions of supernatural belief, which is very appealing to me because it sort of implies that storytelling isn't just like a frivolous entertainment, but it's absolutely essential and integral to us being able to function as a society and as people. Yeah. Which, as a writer, I'm like, oh, I'm necessary.
Well, not only that, but it sounds like you actually felt that necessity reciprocated in your growing up and your family and all of that. Can you talk a little bit about that, just this, and I don't want to call it a genre, but folklore and parables and their place for us?
Yeah, I get very jazzed up about this topic, so I can talk an ear off for hours about this, but I'm incredibly fascinated by the way that the fantastical can at times be more accurate or representational of a human emotion or experience than perhaps the facts of a matter can. So this difference between like fact and truth. And so for me to hear a folktale, which is based in these sort of archetypes, often paranormal archetypes, you are able to click into it in this way where you can always see something of yourself in it. Often there's sort of Jungian archetypes draped over these stories, and so no matter what, they function as a mirror. And anyone can hear a folktale and it means something to them in a very personal way. And so I love to play with that language of the folktale and the fairy tale as a way of talking about what we are dealing with every day as people.
Right, yes. Talking about a career, and you were talking about making up a major at Hampshire or, using magical thinking in what you wanted to study. you talked about, yes, you talked about making up a career. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I think it has to do with you becoming a writer and taking that on.
Yeah, so I think when I was young, especially when I was in college and I would tell people what I was studying, specifically often people with more traditional mindsets in terms of what a life looks like in society today, I would receive a lot of kind of glib statements saying like, oh, poetry, well, that sounds lucrative. And I just always found it incredibly condescending and offensive. And so partly out of spite, I decided that I was going to sort of forge a path in which I invented a way to live sustainably doing exactly what I wanted to do. In ways just to prove other people wrong, because like I love to stick it to anyone trying to insult me, but also just to prove to myself that there were other ways to be a person than the common narratives, and to also sort of be an example to show other people that they don't have to stay in the rigidity that we are fed.
Yeah.
And so in ways it was deliberate, in ways it happened organically, but at this point in my life I'm writing full time, and I do that in a number of ways, some of which are fairly untraditional. When I first graduated college, I wanted to travel, and I've always been unable to sit still. I'm an incredibly restless person. I can't go more than a couple months without dashing off somewhere new. So I knew I wanted to travel. I knew I wanted to write. I knew I wanted to be able to eat food while I was doing those two things. And so I started composing poems to order on the street from an antique typewriter for donation. And I created this little pack where I had my travel backpack, and I had a collapsible table and a little 7-pound typewriter and a tablecloth and a sign and a little fold-up stool. And I'd stuff them all in my backpack, and then I would travel for months in various parts of Europe and the United States, and would just kind of unfurl my wares and then write poems. And it was this really beautiful way of connecting with the community that I had entered, especially as a newcomer or a visitor. It was a way to tangibly connect with people when I was alone, because I always traveled alone. Wow. And also to connect with myself as a writer and to make a little money while I traveled. And that ended up becoming sustainable enough that I quit all my coffee shop barista jobs, of which I had many, and eventually formed a company, which I run out of Boston still, where I trained other poets to also write poems to order, and we now go to universities and corporate events and museums and write poems to order for visitors and event goers.
That's wonderful. So you created a business doing this.
I did create a business.
Good for you.
So.
That's very impressive.
Yeah, and so I do that as well as various other commissioned projects and also my own writing and my own books. Which have become more and more sustainable over the years as well.
I think it's great for people to hear that that's a possibility. So in your travels, I know that you went to Shakespearean Company and spent some time there. Can you give folks a snapshot of Shakespearean Company in Paris?
Yeah, so Shakespearean Company, for those who don't know, is a English language literary hub. It's a bookstore right in the center of Paris. It's right next to Notre Dame. And for decades and decades, it has been this sort of bohemian watering hole for writers to come and gather and write and connect. And they let writers come and sleep for free on the floor of the shop. Today, I think they run it a little more concretely, where there's an application process. But back in my day, you just sort of show up. Yeah. And I had typed poems to order in front of the shop a year prior to me staying there, and so I befriended a number of the booksellers, and I wanted to go back and I wanted to stay there, and so I messaged my friends there and was like, "You think there's a spot for me at the shop? I want to come." And they were like, "Well, officially not, but we'll be waiting for you."
That's so great.
So
you were
I showed
able
up.
to do it.
Yeah, so I showed up at the door, and basically I spent 3 months living in this bookstore, which was quite an ordeal and an experience. It was this amazing, strange, bohemian, like dream swirl. Yeah. Like literally we were sleeping in the stacks. There's not separate bedrooms. You'd unfurl your sleeping bag among the books, and then you'd wake up in the morning and roll it up and hide it, and then you'd help customers throughout the day. And it was actually in that time that I wrote The Lumberjack's Dove, which is the book of mine that ended up winning the National Poetry Series. And so I would sort of type all day, working on chipping away at the book, and then all night, me and the other writers living there would like drink a couple bottles of wine and sit by the Seine and announce poems to each other.
It sounds so picturesque and so perfect. Yeah.
We all had coughs too. It was raining. We all had a cough. We all thought we were dying of consumption like Keats. It was, even our misery was romantic.
Of course.
At least in retrospect.
Let's talk about Lumberjack's Dove a little bit, because Louise Gluck, who is a National Book Award winner as well as Pulitzer Prize winner, selected this book of yours for the National Poetry Series Award. Yeah.
So that, I mean, was such an incredible honor. Louise Glick also is a former Poet Laureate of the United States and Vermont as well, I believe. And she, so she was one of the judges for this competition, and she selected the manuscript, which means she kind of plucked me out of obscurity and gave me this amazing gift. It was essentially winning the poet's lottery. And not only that, but she incredibly went to Echo, my publisher with HarperCollins, and requested that she stay on board and edit the book with me, which usually a judge will just select the book and then step back and walk away, and that's that. And that's all they're being paid to do, is select a book. And she specifically just wanted to be involved, wanted to have a personal connection with the work, was passionate about it, and so I ended up going over to her house every other week for about 4 or 5 months, and we would just hang out at her kitchen table, and she would brutalize me, and it was amazing. She would tear the book apart, and I was like, yes, tell me how you really feel. And she's brilliant, and was exactly the kind of reader that I wanted for that, someone who would really be willing to not let me get away with anything.
With the Lumberjack's Dove, you do have a big publisher behind you, but it sounds like you've been doing most of the production for the tours.
Yeah, so no one in their right mind would schedule a book tour the way that I scheduled a book tour, which is that I did almost 100 readings across the country. I was on the road for 8 months solid in a new city every 2 days. And when I told my publisher, Echo, that this was my plan, I think they kind of squinted at me and were like, is it though? Is that what you're gonna do? I don't think they actually believed I would be able to book that many shows, but they clearly underestimated the obscene number of emails that I am capable of sending. So yeah, I booked this wild tour across America. Maybe what kind of inspired me to do it this way was I'd been hanging out with musicians for a number of years, and I kept seeing them touring, and I became very envious that I didn't get to tour. So I decided to book a tour sort of in that style, like a big national hubbub.
Wow.
And I think a lot about the way that literature is presented live. And we kind of have this interesting divide where you have performance poetry, slam poetry on one end, which is performative, theatrical, but also a very specific genre. And then you have what's considered page poetry on another end, which is a different writing style, but also it's very rarely performed with much chutzpah. And so I really felt like there was this gap in the middle where a piece that would be traditionally considered page poetry, yet presented in a theatrical way. So I ended up collaborating with an incredible artist who's also a local artist here. Her name's Maria Pugnetti. Her artist moniker is Woolly Mar. And I commissioned her to create a cranky for the Lumberjack's Dove, which is a moving panorama where you turn a little crank on the top and it pans across the screen. And what she did was make a 60-foot long, hand-cranked, hand-cut paper silhouette shadow panorama that animated the story as I performed it. And so, yeah, I created this condensed version of the book, so it felt like a complete story, though it was probably a half of the text that was in the book. And then I traveled all over the country performing the book and hand-turning this crank that Maria had made. And, yeah, trying to create a more engaging presence for the story, because I really do feel like written English and spoken English we think of as one language, but they're these two different languages that we've just gotten good at translating rapidly between. And so as soon as you step in front of an audience, and as soon as your words become oral instead of auditory, or instead of literate, then you have to be aware of what the audience is hearing, what the audience is seeing, what it feels like in the space they're in. So I figured if I was going to be conscious of those, I may as well go all out.
I think you did go all out.
Like I did too.
You did. But you had the energy and the stamina to do it.
I was very tired the whole time.
Were you?
Oh yeah. I mean, I would drive 5 or 6 hours. I'd wake up, drive 5 or 6 hours, roll into a bookstore or a university or a literary festival, put together this cranky, which was I'd have to collapse it and reassemble it every day. I had dreams of having a roadie that would do it for me, but no. And then perform the show, then usually schmooze with whoever came after, and then often I was staying with either friends or friends of friends, or sometimes the booksellers would host me, so then have like that social interaction after. And then meanwhile I was writing my next book, which was a collection of short stories, so I would then stay up till like 1 or 2 a.m. typing.
Wild.
And on the nights I wasn't staying with a friend, I had actually converted my little Honda Fit into a camper and was sleeping in the back of my car on the side of the road. So some nights I was hunting for a place to park and then would stay up with like curtains over the windows of my car typing, and then I'd wake up the next morning.
What period of time
and
are
do
we
it again.
looking at? How long were you doing this?
8 months.
8 months.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
That's
some
wild.
might say too long.
Yeah, it's called Create a Tour, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was great though. I don't regret a bit of it.
Oh, that's what. Well, it's certainly an adventure. Also, one other, just to do a shout out, you did another collaboration with an artist, a local artist.
I did, yes. Are you referring to
Susan Osgood?
Oh, yes. I've collaborated with a few artists now, so which I like not knowing which we're talking about because it means I have enough artists in my life. So I did this incredible collaboration with a local printmaker named Susan Osgood called A Ghost of Water. And this was actually a commissioned project, which is my favorite commission project I've ever done, where I was brought on by a wonderful patron of Susan's work, named Eberhard, who's based in Germany. And he brought me on to write a series of 18 poems, each based on a different print of Susan's. And together we published the works in this beautiful hardcover book that Eberhard funded and produced. And they were this sort of mythic landscape. Many of them take place in, at least my poems take place in this kind of post-apocalyptic world where all the water is gone. So it's in part talking about absence, in part talking about what is a ghost. Is it the absence of something? Is it longing for something? As well as kind of an ecological exploration of a post-water world. Yeah. And it was so fun to work on this because Susan's work in certain ways is very concrete and very sensory, and in other ways is very abstract and interpretive. Yeah. So I was able to sort of float in these beautiful map-like prints and create whatever world I felt like I wanted to create from it. Wow. Which it was a wonderful project.
GennaRose, you've also been working on this other book called Leanna Fled the Cranberry Bog, and it's a story in cootie catchers.
Yes.
So can you give us a picture of this?
Yeah, I should have brought one along, but
we'll do a cutaway.
Okay, yeah. So Leanna Fled the Cranberry Bog came out this past October, and it is. Do you remember the kids game where you fold up a piece of paper and you say, "Okay, choose a number." Bloop, 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 bloop. Yeah. So it's a story told entirely in these sort of ephemeral childhood objects, these fortune-telling objects, and it's a series of 26 of them, and they coalesce to tell this sort of horror story. And it functions in a way like a choose-your-own-adventure because every flap has a different option. So you open one flap and the character is eaten by bears. You open another flap and she hops a train westward. And every single one of these unfurls into 8 different potential options. And I think of them as sort of all being simultaneously true, even if they're contradictory, personally. But and I collaborated with an amazing painter named Bobby Detrani, who's also a local artist here. We've got so many amazing local artists that I can't help but steal them up for myself. But so Bobby illustrated every single panel of every single one of these. So it was over 200 full-color illustrations in order to create this very strange 3-dimensional graphic novel, essentially. And it was published by a wonderful small press that's based in East Hampton called Nine Pin Press. They specifically publish spooky stories in the form of games. They just did such a beautiful job with it, and when you receive the book, it's basically in like a vinyl sleeve, so it looks like what a record would come in, and then you pull them out. There's 26 loose leaf sheets, and you fold them yourself. So it's simultaneously the sort of sensory nostalgia of folding and assembling these objects, and then it's kind of a game and kind of a story. And kind of a crafting activity.
That's wonderful. And this, if people go to your website, I assume that this is available there.
It is. It's also available in local bookstores. I know Everyone's Books carries it here. And also Nine Pin Press's website directly. You can order from them. It's a great stay-at-home activity if you're looking for more things to do.
Speaking of which, you have been spending a lot of time in Brattleboro during the pandemic. You came back from New Orleans, I believe.
I did.
And can you talk a little bit about the Brattleboro-New Orleans migration connection?
Yeah, so for the past few years, I have been spending half of my time in New England and half of my time in New Orleans. So I spend the winters down south, and I spend the summers up here, as if I were 50 years older than I am. And I really feel like I kind of cracked the code on how to survive in New England.
Yes,
but,
that is definitely one answer. That's pretty, good deal.
So when the pandemic hit, I was actually down there, and it was very intense in New Orleans. The contagion rates were incredibly high, and it was a very real, scary danger. And so I was there for a few months, just really quilting a lot and cooking a lot of new foods. I did murder a sourdough starter, as I believe many of us may have done.
There have been a lot of casualties with sourdough over the last 6 months.
True. My roommate walked in on me just pouring it cold-bloodedly down the sink and looked at me like I just drowned a child.
Oh, God.
So, and then I ended up driving up here in late May and just sort of felt this burden lift as I was able to actually be in nature and have the freedom of being in a rural area in a time when being in an urban area is not very conducive at the moment to anything.
That's right. And you've been working on another book as well.
I have. Yeah, so I am in the final throes of finishing a novel right now. As I mentioned before, I was working on a short story collection when I was on tour. I completed that, and then after that, my next project is I have this novel, which is, like all of my work, folklore inspired, and also inspired by some of my own ancestral history as well. My mother's side, which is Ashkenazi Jewish, and my family came over to the United States to flee pogroms in Eastern Europe, and so part of it is based in that history as well as some Russian traditional folklore. So I have never written a novel before, and I'm currently almost 70,000 words in out of around 80.
Wow.
So there are some things in the works that I cannot yet say.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
That's good to know. That's something to look forward to.
Yeah, so it's definitely getting out there.
I'm sure that we'll be hearing about it. I feel like I've been on a whirlwind on your...
Yeah, well, there's a lot of places to go in my sordid past. So.
Well, traveling nationally and internationally and setting up and tearing down and meeting people and performing and clowning. We've kind of done the gamut this afternoon. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Yes, it was really fun to have you on. And I do want to mention to folks that GennaRose's books are available locally, both through her the Lumberjack's Dove, which is a HarperCollins Echo book, and also Nine Pin Press, which is also local. We always encourage people to order and buy at their local bookstores, of which we are lucky enough to have some. So thank you, GennaRose.
Thank you, Annie. This was lovely.
It was really wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks to all of you for joining us today on this afternoon. And the information to get in touch with GennaRose or her website, all that will be following this outro of mine, which is going to stop right around now. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week with someone else from the Brattleboro area who is doing fantastic things.